At my baby shower, my mother-in-law handed me a glass of champagne with the strangest smile I'd ever seen. "To new beginnings," she said, but her eyes held something darker. What I didn't know was that for 3 months, she'd been tampering with my medication. And what happened next would expose a web of deception that nearly destroyed my marriage and put my health at serious risk. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of my baby shower started like any other Saturday in Millbrook, North Carolina. I woke up in the house Tyler and I had been renting since our wedding 8 months ago, sunlight streaming through the gauze curtains I'd hung to make the place feel more like home. The air smelled of the lavender candles Tyler's mother, Patricia Bell, had given us as a housewarming gift. She'd insisted they would help with relaxation and fertility. At the time, I thought it was sweet how invested she was in our future family. My name is Brianna Hayes, and back then I believed I was living the life I'd always dreamed of. I'd married my college sweetheart, landed a marketing job at a nonprofit downtown, and we were trying to start a family. The only shadow in our otherwise perfect picture was Patricia's overwhelming presence in every aspect of our lives. She had opinions about our furniture, our finances, our weekend plans, and especially about when we were going to give her grandchildren. Tyler always brushed off my concerns about his mother's involvement. "She just cares," he'd say, wrapping his arms around me in that way that used to make everything feel okay. "She's excited about becoming a grandmother." But there was something in Patricia's attention that felt less like care and more like control. She had a key to our house, ostensibly for emergencies, but I'd come home to find her reorganizing our kitchen cabinets or doing laundry she claimed I'd forgotten. The baby shower was Patricia's idea, of course. We weren't even pregnant yet, but she insisted it would be good luck, a way to manifest the family we wanted. Positive visualization, she called it, her voice taking on that slightly condescending tone she used when she thought she knew better than everyone else. She'd booked the community center, invited what felt like half the town, and handled every detail without asking what Tyler and I actually wanted. That Saturday morning, as I stood in front of our bathroom mirror applying mascara, I felt a familiar wave of nausea wash over me. It had been happening for weeks, this queasy feeling that struck at random moments. I'd mentioned it to Tyler, wondering if it might be morning sickness, but 3 pregnancy tests had come back negative. My doctor had suggested it might be stress, or a reaction to the new vitamins Patricia had recommended I start taking. The vitamins were another of Patricia's helpful suggestions. She'd shown up one evening with a pharmacy bag full of supplements she claimed would boost my fertility: folic acid, iron, prenatal vitamins, and my regular birth control pills that she'd offered to pick up when I mentioned I was running low. At the time, I was grateful for her thoughtfulness. Tyler worked long hours at the accounting firm, and having someone care enough to handle these small errands felt like a blessing. Tyler found me in the bathroom, leaning against the sink with my eyes closed, waiting for the nausea to pass. His reflection appeared behind mine in the mirror, concern creasing his forehead. He was already dressed in the khakis and button-down shirt his mother had specifically requested he wear, claiming it would photograph better. Even our clothing choices weren't really our own anymore. "You feeling sick again?" he asked, his hand finding the small of my back. His touch was gentle, but I could hear the frustration in his voice. We'd been trying to conceive for 6 months, and every negative pregnancy test felt like a small failure. Patricia hadn't made it easier, asking pointed questions about our progress and offering increasingly invasive advice about timing and positioning. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without vomiting. The smell of Tyler's aftershave, something that usually comforted me, seemed overpowering. Everything had been too intense lately. Smells, sounds, even the texture of certain foods made me feel like my skin was crawling. I'd started avoiding the grocery store because the fluorescent lights gave me headaches, and I'd had to leave work early twice because the coffee smell from the break room made me nauseous. "Maybe we should cancel," Tyler suggested, but we both knew that wasn't an option. Patricia had already confirmed the catering, decorated the venue, and sent out reminder texts to all 37 guests. Disappointing her wasn't just inconvenient, it was something Tyler seemed physically incapable of doing. His relationship with his mother was complicated, in ways I was only beginning to understand. By the time we arrived at the Millbrook Community Center, Patricia had transformed the bland meeting room into something that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Soft pink and cream decorations covered every surface, complete with a dessert table that could have fed twice as many people. She'd even hired a photographer, a young woman named Stephanie who kept snapping candid shots of the setup, while Patricia directed her with the precision of a film director. The guests began arriving around noon, a mix of Patricia's church friends, Tyler's female cousins, and a few of my coworkers who'd been invited despite barely knowing Patricia. I recognized the dynamic immediately. This wasn't really a party for me, it was Patricia's show, with me as the somewhat reluctant star. She introduced me to each guest as my future daughter-in-law who's going to make me the most wonderful grandmother, as if my primary purpose was to fulfill her maternal ambitions. My best friend Chloe arrived fashionably late, taking in the scene with the kind of expression she usually reserved for particularly dramatic reality TV shows. She'd been skeptical of Patricia from the beginning, claiming something about Tyler's mother felt performative. "She's like someone playing the role of a caring mother-in-law," Chloe had said after meeting Patricia for the first time. "But she's not quite hitting the right notes." Chloe found me by the gift table, arranging baby blankets and tiny outfits that felt surreal to touch. We weren't pregnant, but somehow I was surrounded by evidence of Patricia's certainty that we would be soon. The whole afternoon felt like an elaborate form of manifestation, as if surrounding ourselves with baby items would somehow force the universe to comply with Patricia's timeline. "How are you holding up?" Chloe whispered, her dark eyes scanning the room where Patricia was orchestrating group photos with military precision. "You look a little green around the gills." I was about to respond when Patricia's voice cut across the room. "Brianna, sweetie, come stand next to the cake for some photos." Her tone was cheerful, but there was an undercurrent of command that made it clear this wasn't really a request. She'd been directing my movements all afternoon, positioning me like a prop in her elaborate production. The cake was a work of art, 3 tiers decorated with delicate sugar flowers, and a top that read "Future Baby Hayes" in elegant script. Patricia had ordered it from the most expensive bakery in town, another gesture that felt simultaneously generous and controlling. She had a way of giving gifts that came with invisible strings, each act of kindness creating a debt I wasn't sure how to repay. As I posed next to the cake, Patricia moved through the crowd with a pitcher of champagne punch, filling glasses and making sure everyone had a drink in hand for the toast she'd undoubtedly planned. The photographer captured each moment, but I felt disconnected from it all, like I was watching someone else's life unfold through a window. The nausea hit again, stronger this time, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. Patricia appeared at my side instantly, her expression shifting to what looked like concern but felt somehow calculated. "Are you all right, honey?" she asked loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "You've been looking a little peaked lately." Her hand found my arm, squeezing gently in what others probably saw as comfort, but felt more like control. "Maybe you should sit down for a moment." Before I could protest, Patricia was guiding me to a chair she'd positioned in the center of the room, creating a small scene that drew everyone's attention. The photographer continued snapping photos, capturing what would look like a caring mother-in-law, tending to her overwhelmed daughter-in-law. But something about Patricia's touch, about the way she positioned herself in the frame, felt wrong. "Let me get you some water," she said. But instead of water, she returned with a glass of the champagne punch she'd been serving. "This might settle your stomach. Sometimes a little alcohol can help with nerves." The suggestion struck me as odd. Patricia was usually very health-conscious, always reading articles about nutrition and sharing them with unsolicited advice. She'd lectured me about caffeine consumption and insisted I switch to organic produce, claiming everything I put in my body would affect my future pregnancy. Offering alcohol seemed completely out of character. But I was feeling dizzy and wanted to avoid making a scene, so I accepted the glass. The punch was sweet, almost cloying, with an aftertaste that seemed slightly medicinal. Patricia watched me drink with an intensity that made me uncomfortable, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "There's my good girl," she said softly, patting my shoulder. "I knew you'd feel better with a little something in your system." The phrase stuck with me. Good girl. It was the way you'd speak to a child or a pet, not to a grown woman. But before I could dwell on it, Patricia was calling for everyone's attention, raising her own glass for the toast she'd been building toward all afternoon. "I just want to thank everyone for being here today," she began, her voice carrying easily across the room. "Brianna and Tyler are going to make such wonderful parents, and I couldn't be more excited about becoming a grandmother." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled guests before landing on me with that same strange intensity. "Some people wait their whole lives to feel this kind of joy," she continued. "The joy of knowing your family is growing, that all your hopes and dreams are finally coming true." Her words were lovely, the kind of sentiment that should have made me feel cherished and supported. But there was something in her tone, in the way she was looking at me, that made my skin crawl. Everyone raised their glasses, and I lifted mine automatically, though the champagne punch suddenly tasted wrong. Too sweet, with an chemical undertone that made me wonder if something had gone bad. I set the glass down after taking just a small sip, but Patricia was there immediately, encouraging me to drink more.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"It's a special recipe," she said, her hand on my back guiding the glass toward my lips. "My grandmother's champagne punch. She used to say it brought good luck to young wives." The way she said it, with a slight emphasis on the word wives, felt loaded with meaning I couldn't quite grasp. The rest of the shower passed in a blur of opened gifts, posed photographs, and conversations that felt like they were happening to someone else. I found myself studying Patricia's face, looking for clues to explain the growing uneasiness I felt whenever she was near. She was perfectly polite, appropriately maternal, saying all the right things. But underneath the performance, I sensed something calculating, something that had very little to do with love and everything to do with control. By the time the last guest left, I was exhausted in a way that felt disproportionate to the afternoon's activities. Tyler was helping Patricia clean up while I sat in the same chair she'd positioned me in hours earlier, watching them work together with the easy coordination of people who'd been a team long before I entered the picture. "Wasn't that wonderful?" Patricia said as she packed leftover cake into containers she'd brought for the purpose. "I think it went perfectly. Everyone was so happy for you two." She said it like she'd orchestrated not just the party, but our happiness itself, like our emotions were another detail she could arrange to her satisfaction. Tyler loaded the gifts into our car, while Patricia gave me what felt like a formal debriefing of the afternoon. Which guests had seemed most impressed, which photos had turned out best, which gifts we should prioritize writing thank you notes for. She had opinions about everything, down to the order in which we should display the baby items in our future nursery. "I picked up your prescription refill while I was out yesterday," she mentioned casually as we prepared to leave. "I noticed you were running low, so I saved you a trip to the pharmacy." She handed me a small white bag with my name on it, the same monthly birth control prescription I'd been taking for years. I thanked her, though something about her helpfulness continued to bother me. It was too much, too constant, too invasive, but Tyler seemed to see nothing wrong with his mother's level of involvement in our lives, and questioning her generosity felt ungrateful. That night, as I lay in bed next to Tyler, I replayed the afternoon in my mind. Patricia's strange toast, the way she'd watched me drink the champagne punch, her insistence on handling my prescription. Each detail seemed innocent enough on its own, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't quite identify. The nausea returned as I was falling asleep, stronger than it had been in weeks. I made it to the bathroom just in time, spending the next hour alternating between vomiting and sitting on the cool tile floor, waiting for my stomach to settle. Tyler found me there around midnight, concern etched across his face. "This has been going on too long," he said, helping me back to bed. "Maybe we should call Dr. Martinez in the morning. There might be something wrong that we're missing." But even as he said it, I could hear the hope in his voice. We both wanted to believe the nausea meant what we'd been hoping for, that despite the negative pregnancy tests, somehow our dream of starting a family was finally coming true. It would be weeks before I learned that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who claim to want the same things you do, who wrap their manipulation in the language of love and support. As I finally drifted off to sleep, Patricia's words echoed in my mind. "My good girl," she'd said, watching me drink from the glass she'd prepared. At the time, I dismissed it as an awkward attempt at maternal affection. I had no way of knowing that it was actually the voice of someone who saw me not as a daughter-in-law to love, but as an obstacle to control, someone who had been planning for months to take my choices away from me, one pill at a time. The appointment with Dr. Martinez came 3 days later, on a Wednesday afternoon, that felt heavy with unspoken possibilities. Tyler had insisted on driving me, his hands gripping the steering wheel with the kind of tension that spoke to hopes he was afraid to voice. We'd been down this road before, literally and figuratively, sitting in medical waiting rooms filled with outdated magazines and the quiet desperation of couples navigating fertility challenges. Dr. Martinez had been my physician since college, a soft-spoken woman in her 50s who had a way of delivering both good and bad news with equal compassion. Her office smelled of lavender and antiseptic, a combination that usually comforted me but now made my already queasy stomach churn. I sat on the examination table while Tyler occupied the single visitor chair, both of us pretending this was just a routine checkup rather than another attempt to understand why my body seemed to be rebelling against me. "Tell me about these symptoms again," Dr. Martinez said, her pen poised over my chart. "When did the nausea start, and have you noticed any patterns?" Her questions were thorough, professional, the same ones she'd asked during previous visits, when we'd hoped morning sickness might explain my discomfort. I recounted the timeline as best I could remember. The queasiness had started roughly 8 weeks ago, around the time Patricia had begun her increased involvement in our lives. It struck at random moments, sometimes mild enough to ignore, other times severe enough to send me rushing to the bathroom. Food aversions had developed gradually, along with heightened sensitivity to smells and sounds that had never bothered me before. "Have you changed anything in your routine recently?" Dr. Martinez asked. "New medications, supplements, diet changes?" Her tone remained neutral, but I caught the slight emphasis on medications. It was the kind of question that suggested she was already forming hypotheses about potential causes. I mentioned the vitamins Patricia had recommended, pulling the bottles from my purse to show Dr. Martinez the labels. Prenatal vitamins, folic acid, iron supplements, all standard recommendations for women trying to conceive. Nothing that should have been causing adverse reactions, especially not the severe ones I'd been experiencing. "And you're still taking your regular birth control?" she asked, making notes in my file. It was a routine question, one she'd asked during every visit since I'd started the medication years ago. But something about the way she said it made me pause. "Yes, the same prescription I've been on for 3 years. I replied. "Same pharmacy, same routine." I didn't mention that Patricia had been picking up my refills lately. It seemed like an irrelevant detail, just another example of her helpfulness that Tyler saw as caring, and I was beginning to find invasive. Dr. Martinez nodded, but her expression suggested she was working through something in her mind. "I'd like to run some blood tests," she said finally. "Basic metabolic panel, hormone levels, and a few others just to get a complete picture. Sometimes our bodies can develop sensitivities to things we've been tolerating fine for years." The blood draw was routine, but as I sat with the needle in my arm, watching my blood fill multiple vials, I felt a strange sense of foreboding. Tyler held my hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on my palm, but even his touch couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to learn something that would change everything. "The results should be back by Friday," Dr. Martinez said as we prepared to leave. "I'll call you personally with the findings." She paused at the door, studying my face with the kind of intensity that suggested she was seeing something I wasn't aware of myself. "In the meantime, if the symptoms get worse, don't hesitate to come in immediately." The drive home was quiet, both Tyler and I lost in our own thoughts. He was probably hoping the tests would reveal a pregnancy we'd somehow missed, while I found myself dreading what they might show. There was something about the timing of my symptoms, the way they'd coincided with Patricia's increased presence in our lives, that felt too coincidental to ignore. That evening, Patricia called during dinner with her usual impeccable timing. She had a talent for interrupting private moments, appearing at our door or calling, just when Tyler and I were settling into conversations about our relationship or future plans. Her voice carried through Tyler's speakerphone with the cheerful authority of someone who expected her calls to be welcome, regardless of timing. "I was just thinking about Brianna's little health scare," she said, her tone mixing concern with something that sounded almost pleased. "How did the doctor's visit go?" "I do hope everything is all right." The way she said it suggested she already knew the answer, or at least hoped for a specific outcome. Tyler launched into a detailed recap of the appointment, sharing information I would have preferred to keep private. But he'd never learned to maintain boundaries with his mother, treating her more like a partner in our marriage than an outside observer. Patricia listened with what sounded like rapt attention, asking questions that felt more invasive than supportive. "Blood tests are so smart," she said when Tyler finished his summary. "Dr. Martinez will get to the bottom of this, I'm sure. These things usually turn out to be exactly what we hope they are." Her laugh was light, almost musical, but it sent an unexpected chill down my spine. She sounded like someone who knew something the rest of us didn't. After Tyler hung up, I found myself staring at the bottles of vitamins Patricia had given me, lined up on our kitchen counter like tiny soldiers. Something about them bothered me, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. They looked exactly like the supplements I'd purchased myself in the past. Same brands, same dosages, same everything. But holding them in my hands felt different somehow, like they carried weight beyond their actual contents. Friday afternoon brought Dr. Martinez's call while I was at work, trying to focus on a marketing campaign that suddenly seemed trivial compared to the questions swirling in my mind. I stepped outside to take the call, finding a quiet spot in the parking lot where I could speak privately. "Brianna, I need you to come in as soon as possible," Dr. Martinez said without preamble. Her voice carried an urgency that made my heart start racing. "There are some irregularities in your blood work that we need to discuss in person." "What kind of irregularities?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know. The way she said it suggested something beyond routine abnormalities, something that required careful explanation rather than a quick phone conversation. "I'd rather discuss this face-to-face," she replied. "Can you come in this afternoon? I've had my receptionist clear a slot for you at 4 o'clock. The fact that she was making special accommodations spoke to the seriousness of whatever she'd discovered. Dr. Martinez was thorough, but not typically dramatic about test results. I called Tyler to let him know about the appointment, but he was in back-to-back meetings and couldn't leave work early. For once, I was grateful for his absence. Something told me this conversation would be easier to handle alone, without the added pressure of managing his reactions alongside my own. Dr. Martinez's office felt different that afternoon, the familiar space somehow more clinical, more serious. She gestured for me to sit in the chair across from her desk rather than on the examination table, creating a sense of intimacy that suggested we were about to have a conversation rather than a medical consultation. "Your hormone levels are extremely unusual," she began, pulling out printed lab results covered in numbers I didn't understand. "Your estrogen and progesterone are fluctuating in ways that don't match your reported contraceptive use. It's almost like your body is trying to ovulate despite being on birth control." I stared at the papers, trying to make sense of what she was telling me. "Is that why I've been feeling sick?" I asked. "Can birth control stop working suddenly after years of being effective?" "That's what's puzzling," Dr. Martinez continued. "Your blood shows traces of the synthetic hormones that should be preventing ovulation, but they're at much lower levels than they should be with consistent daily use. Either your body has developed an unusual resistance to the medication, or—" She paused, studying my face carefully. "Or what?" I prompted, though something in her expression told me I wasn't going to like the answer. "Or you're not actually receiving the full dose of hormones that should be in your birth control pills," she said gently. "The levels in your blood suggest you're getting perhaps half the active ingredients you should be receiving." The words hit me like cold water, suddenly making connections I hadn't wanted to consider. "How is that possible?" I asked, though my mind was already racing ahead to explanations I didn't want to accept. "There are several possibilities," Dr. Martinez said carefully. "Manufacturing defects, though that would be extremely rare and would affect multiple patients. Storage issues, if the pills were exposed to heat or moisture that degraded the active ingredients. Or—" She paused again, and I could see her choosing her words with deliberate care. Or, someone has been tampering with them, I finished, voicing the possibility that had been growing in my mind since she'd started explaining the test results. Dr. Martinez nodded slowly. I want to stress that we can't jump to conclusions, she said. But the blood work suggests that whatever you're taking isn't providing the contraceptive protection it should be. Given your symptoms and the timing, I'd recommend bringing in your current pack of pills so we can have them tested. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what she was telling me. The nausea, the heightened sensitivity, the emotional volatility I'd been experiencing, all made sense if my birth control had been compromised. But the implications of that possibility were too enormous to fully grasp in a single conversation. Dr. Martinez, I said finally, if someone were tampering with birth control pills, how would they do it? Hypothetically, I mean. I was trying to sound clinical, academic, but my voice betrayed the growing fear I was feeling. There are several methods, she replied, matching my careful tone. Pills could be removed and replaced with placebos or lower-dose versions. They could be altered chemically, though that would require some knowledge of pharmacology. Or they could be damaged deliberately through exposure to heat or moisture, which would degrade the active ingredients over time. Each possibility felt more terrifying than the last. The idea that someone might have been deliberately sabotaging my contraception, putting my health at risk, and violating my reproductive choices made me feel sick in an entirely different way than the nausea I'd been experiencing. I need you to think carefully about who has had access to your medication, Dr. Martinez continued. Anyone who's been in your home. Anyone who might have handled your pills or your purse. I know it's an uncomfortable possibility to consider, but if someone has been tampering with your birth control, it's a serious violation that goes beyond just medical concerns. I thought about Patricia's helpful offer to pick up my prescriptions, the way she'd inserted herself into every aspect of our lives, her obvious eagerness for Tyler and me to start having children. The baby shower that had felt more like her event than mine, the way she'd watched me drink that champagne punch with such intense satisfaction. Details that had seemed merely invasive now took on a much darker significance. What should I do? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the implications of what we were discussing. If someone has been tampering with my medication, how do I prove it? How do I protect myself? First, bring me your current pack of pills for testing, Dr. Martinez said. Second, I'm going to prescribe a different form of contraception that can't be tampered with as easily. And third, you need to think very seriously about who might have both the motive and the opportunity to do something like this. The drive home felt surreal, like I was moving through a world that had fundamentally changed while looking exactly the same. I stopped at a different pharmacy, one Patricia had never been to, and filled the prescription for a contraceptive patch that would be much harder for anyone to alter. The pharmacist's casual friendliness felt jarring against the storm of suspicions building in my mind. At home, I went straight to the bathroom and retrieved my current pack of birth control pills from the medicine cabinet. They looked completely normal, identical to every pack I'd received for years. But now I found myself examining each individual pill, looking for signs of tampering I wouldn't have known to recognize before. I placed them in a small plastic bag, trying to handle them as little as possible in case there was somehow forensic evidence to preserve. The whole process felt simultaneously ridiculous and terrifying. Was I really suspecting my mother-in-law of tampering with my medication? Was I losing my grip on reality, seeing conspiracies where none existed? But as I stood in our bathroom, holding what might be evidence of a violation so intimate it made my skin crawl, I remembered Patricia's words from the baby shower. "My good girl," she'd said, watching me drink from the glass she'd prepared. At the time, it had seemed like awkward affection. Now it sounded like the satisfaction of someone whose plan was working exactly as intended. Tyler came home to find me sitting at our kitchen table, staring at the bag of pills like they might spontaneously confess their secrets. He took one look at my face and knew that whatever Dr. Martinez had told me had changed everything. "What did she say?" he asked, settling into the chair across from me with the kind of careful attention he usually reserved for serious conversations about our future. I told him everything, watching his expression shift from confusion to disbelief, to something that looked almost like fear. He picked up the bag of pills, examining them as I had, looking for obvious signs of tampering that neither of us would have been able to identify. "This can't be right," he said finally. "You're suggesting that someone has been deliberately sabotaging your birth control? That's insane, Brianna. Who would do something like that?" I didn't answer immediately, but we both knew there was only one person who had the combination of motive, opportunity, and detailed knowledge of my daily routine required to carry out such a plan. The silence stretched between us, filled with an accusation neither of us wanted to voice. "My mother would never do something like this," Tyler said, but his voice lacked conviction. "She's controlling, yes, but she's not malicious. She wouldn't put your health at risk just to get grandchildren faster." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think that my growing suspicions were just paranoia, the product of stress and too many medical dramas. But the evidence was mounting in ways that were becoming impossible to ignore. Patricia's enthusiasm about our fertility, her insistence on handling my prescriptions, her obvious disappointment every month when I wasn't pregnant, her strange behavior at the baby shower. "Tyler," I said carefully, "I need you to really think about this. Your mother has been picking up my prescriptions for months. She has unlimited access to our house. She's been pushing us to have children since before we were even married. And now my birth control isn't working properly." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his way of processing information he didn't want to accept. "Even if that were true," he said, "how could we prove it? And what would we do about it?" The questions hung in the air between us, representing a crossroads in our relationship that I hadn't seen coming. How do you accuse your husband's mother of such a violation without destroying your marriage? How do you prove something so calculated and secretive that it's designed to leave no obvious traces? "We start by getting these pills tested," I said, gesturing to the bag on the table. "And then we figure out how to protect ourselves from it happening again." That night I lay awake long after Tyler had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the day's revelations. The woman who had raised my husband, who had welcomed me into her family with such apparent warmth, might have been systematically violating my bodily autonomy for months. The thought was so disturbing, so fundamentally wrong, that my mind kept rejecting it even as the evidence continued to mount. But in the darkness of our bedroom, listening to Tyler's steady breathing beside me, I found myself remembering other details that had seemed harmless at the time. Patricia's questions about my cycle, her suggestions about fertility tracking, her casual inquiries about whether we were being careful with contraception. Information she'd gathered under the guise of maternal interest, but that now seemed like reconnaissance for a plan I was only beginning to understand. The worst part was the violation of trust it represented. Not just Patricia's betrayal of me, but the position it put Tyler in, forcing him to choose between his wife and his mother. I could see the conflict already building in his eyes, the way he wanted to defend Patricia while simultaneously grappling with evidence that was becoming harder to dismiss. As I finally drifted towards sleep, one thought kept circling through my mind. If Patricia was capable of tampering with my medication, if she was willing to put my health at risk to satisfy her desire for grandchildren, what else might she be willing to do to get what she wanted? And how far would I have to go to protect myself from someone who was supposed to be family? The laboratory results came back on Tuesday morning while I was sitting in my car outside the Millbrook Public Library, having chosen a neutral location to receive what I suspected would be life-changing news. Dr. Martinez's voice was carefully controlled as she delivered the findings that confirmed my worst fears. "The pills you brought in contain approximately 30% of the active hormones they should have," she said without preamble. "Someone has definitely tampered with them. The molecular structure suggests they've been exposed to deliberate heat treatment, which degrades the synthetic estrogen and progestin while leaving the pills looking completely normal." I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. Hearing confirmation of what I'd suspected didn't bring relief, only a sick certainty that my life had been manipulated in ways I was still discovering. How sophisticated would someone need to be to do this? I asked, though I already knew the question was really about Patricia's capabilities. "Not very," Dr. Martinez replied grimly. a basic understanding of chemistry, access to a controlled heat source, and patience. The process could be done at home, with equipment most people have in their kitchens. The concerning part is how methodical this appears to be. This wasn't random damage or a one-time event. Someone has been systematically reducing the effectiveness of your contraception over an extended period. After ending the call, I sat in the library parking lot for 20 minutes, watching normal people go about their normal lives, while my world rearranged itself around this new reality. Patricia hadn't just been invasive or controlling. She had been conducting a months-long campaign to override my reproductive choices, putting my health at risk and violating my bodily autonomy in ways that felt criminal. I couldn't bring myself to go home yet, couldn't face Tyler's hopeful questions about the test results, or Patricia's inevitable appearance at our door with dinner and unsolicited advice. Instead, I found myself driving to Chloe's apartment, needing to tell someone who would believe me without requiring extensive convincing. Chloe took one look at my face and ushered me inside, settling me on her couch with tea while I recounted the medical findings and their implications. She listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each detail I revealed. "That woman has been drugging you," she said when I finished, her voice flat with disgust. "This isn't meddling or being overeager about grandchildren. This is assault. You realize that, right?" She was pacing now, her anger giving voice to feelings I'd been trying to suppress. "She's been systematically sabotaging your birth control while pretending to care about your well-being." Hearing it stated so bluntly made the violation feel more real, more serious than the clinical terms Dr. Martinez had used. Patricia had been drugging me, in a sense, by removing the drugs I needed to maintain control over my own reproductive system. The betrayal of trust was staggering, but the calculated nature of it was what made me feel truly sick. "What are you going to do?" Chloe asked, settling beside me with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for crisis situations. "You can't pretend this didn't happen. And you can't let her continue having access to your medication or your home." I realized I'd been avoiding thinking about next steps, because they all seemed impossible. How do you confront someone about such a violation? How do you prove intent when the evidence could be dismissed as accident or coincidence? How do you protect yourself from someone who has keys to your house and unlimited access to your husband's loyalty? "I need more evidence," I said finally. "Dr. Martinez confirmed the tampering, but I need to understand the scope of what Patricia has been doing. If she's willing to sabotage my birth control, what else might she have interfered with?" The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to Patricia's house while she was at her weekly bridge game. Tyler was at the office, and I used the key she'd insisted we keep for emergencies to let myself into the pristine colonial where my husband had grown up. The house smelled like the same lavender candles she'd given us, mixed with furniture polish and the faint chemical scent of whatever she used to keep her white carpets spotless. Patricia's home was exactly what you'd expect from someone who needed to control every detail of her environment. Family photos arranged at precise angles, throw pillows positioned with military precision, not a single item out of place or purpose. But as I moved through the rooms, ostensibly looking for evidence of her interference in my life, I began to notice details that revealed a different side of her personality. In the kitchen, Patricia kept a notebook tucked behind her recipe collection, filled with what looked like a tracking system for our lives. Dates of our visits, notes about conversations we'd had, observations about my appearance and behavior that went back months. B seemed tired today, possibly early pregnancy symptoms. Read one entry from 6 weeks ago. Mentioned nausea during dinner. Should encourage more frequent visits to monitor progress. The clinical detachment of her observations was chilling. She'd been studying me like a laboratory subject, documenting every interaction for signs that her plan was working. Page after page revealed the extent of her surveillance, tracking everything from my menstrual cycle to my food preferences to my work schedule. She knew more about my daily routines than I realized, information she'd gathered through seemingly innocent questions and careful observation. But it was the upstairs guest bathroom that provided the most damning evidence. Hidden behind cleaning supplies in the cabinet under the sink, I found a small tackle box containing medical supplies that had no legitimate purpose in a guest bathroom. Syringes, small vials of clear liquid, and a portable heating device that looked like it had been modified for precise temperature control. The setup looked professional, organized, purposeful. Among the supplies, I discovered a manila folder containing what appeared to be research printouts about hormonal contraceptives, their chemical composition, and methods for altering their effectiveness. Patricia had been studying my medication with the thoroughness of someone planning a complex project, learning exactly how to sabotage it without leaving obvious traces. The most disturbing discovery was a calendar marked with dates going back 4 months, each corresponding to the times Patricia had picked up my prescriptions. Beside each date, she'd made notes in tiny handwriting: applied heat treatment, 15 minutes at controlled temp, and replaced 6 pills with placebo alternatives. The documentation was meticulous, showing a level of premeditation that transformed her actions from impulsive interference to calculated assault. I photographed everything with my phone, my hands shaking as I captured evidence of violations I was still struggling to fully comprehend. Patricia hadn't just been tampering with my birth control occasionally or haphazardly. She'd been running a systematic campaign to compromise my contraception while maintaining plausible deniability about her involvement. As I was preparing to leave, I heard a car door slam in the driveway. Through the window, I could see Patricia returning early from bridge, her face set in the pleasant mask she wore for public interactions. Panic flooded my system as I realized I was trapped in her house with evidence of her crimes literally in my hands. I managed to return most items to their hiding places and slip out the back door just as Patricia entered through the front, but I could hear her calling my name as I reached my car. She'd seen the vehicle in her driveway, and there would be no plausible explanation for my presence in her home while she was supposed to be away. "Brianna, sweetie, is that you?" Patricia's voice carried across the yard with its usual artificial warmth, but I could detect an undercurrent of suspicion. "What brings you by this morning? Is everything all right?" I turned to face her, trying to appear casual despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "I was hoping to catch you," I said, the lie coming surprisingly easily. "Tyler mentioned you had some photo albums from his childhood that we could borrow for a project we're working on." Patricia's smile never wavered, but something shifted in her eyes. "Of course, dear, though I'm surprised Tyler didn't mention you were coming by. He usually keeps me informed about these kinds of visits." The way she said it suggested that my presence here was more than just unexpected. It was somehow inappropriate. "It was a last-minute idea," I replied, backing toward my car. "But since you're just getting home, maybe another time would be better. I don't want to interrupt your day." "Nonsense," Patricia said, already moving toward her front door with the kind of determined cheerfulness that brooked no argument. "Come in for coffee. We barely had a chance to chat at the baby shower, and I've been wanting to hear how you're feeling. Tyler mentioned you saw Dr. Martinez recently." The invitation felt more like a command, and I realized that refusing would only increase her suspicions about my real purpose for being there. I followed her inside, hyper-aware of every surface I'd touched, every hiding place I'd disturbed, every piece of evidence I'd discovered that revealed her true nature. Patricia moved through her kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing coffee with the same precision she applied to everything else in her life. She asked about my health, my work, my plans for the weekend, maintaining the facade of maternal interest while I struggled to respond normally. Every question felt loaded with hidden meaning, every casual comment an attempt to gather intelligence about what I knew or suspected. "You know," she said as she handed me a cup of coffee I had no intention of drinking, "I've been thinking about that baby shower. You seemed a little overwhelmed, maybe even unwell. I hope you're not pushing yourself too hard with work and wedding stress." The concern in her voice sounded genuine, but I now understood it was another form of manipulation. Patricia was skilled at using apparent care as a tool for control, wrapping her interference in language that made it difficult to reject without seeming ungrateful or paranoid. "I'm fine," I said, setting the untouched coffee on her pristine counter. "Just some minor digestive issues that Dr. Martinez is helping me work through." "Digestive issues can be so tricky," Patricia replied, her tone remaining conversational despite the sharp attention in her eyes. "Sometimes they're related to stress, sometimes to medication interactions. I do hope you're being careful about what you're putting in your body, especially if you and Tyler are still trying to start a family." The way she said it sent ice through my veins. She was practically admitting to her interference, while maintaining enough plausible deniability to make direct accusations impossible. This was how she'd been operating for months, hiding her manipulations behind layers of apparent concern and maternal wisdom. I excused myself as quickly as politeness allowed, claiming a work emergency that required my immediate attention. Patricia walked me to the door with the same gracious hospitality she'd always shown, but I could feel her watching me drive away with an intensity that made my skin crawl. That afternoon, I called a locksmith and had our house locks changed, telling Tyler it was a routine security precaution that had been overdue. I also installed a small safe in our bedroom closet, somewhere I could store my medication and important documents where Patricia couldn't access them. The measures felt simultaneously paranoid and inadequate, but they were the only way I could think of to protect myself while I figured out how to handle the larger problem. Tyler noticed the changes immediately when he came home from work, questioning the need for new locks and expressing concern about the expense of the safe. His resistance wasn't about money, I realized, but about the implications of what I was protecting myself against. Changing our locks was an acknowledgement that someone we trusted had been violating our home and our privacy. "This is about my mother, isn't it?" He asked that evening as we sat at our kitchen table, the space between us feeling wider than usual. "You think she's been doing something wrong, and now you're treating her like a criminal." I showed him the photographs I'd taken at Patricia's house, watching his expression change as he processed the evidence of his mother's systematic campaign against my reproductive choices. The calendar with its meticulous documentation, the medical supplies hidden in her bathroom, the research about hormonal contraceptives that revealed the depth of her planning. Tyler studied each image in silence, his face growing pale as the implications became impossible to deny. His mother hadn't just been interfering in our lives or expressing enthusiasm about grandchildren. She'd been conducting a calculated assault on my bodily autonomy, violating my trust and putting my health at risk to satisfy her own desires. "This can't be real," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "My mother wouldn't do this. There has to be another explanation." I understood his reluctance to accept what the evidence clearly showed. Patricia had been the most consistent presence in Tyler's life, the parent who'd raised him alone after his father left when Tyler was 12. Accepting that she was capable of such violation meant questioning everything he thought he knew about the person who'd shaped his understanding of love and family. "Tyler," I said gently, "I need you to really look at this evidence. Your mother has been systematically tampering with my birth control for months. She's been documenting my menstrual cycle and monitoring my behavior like I'm a laboratory experiment. This isn't about grandchildren or family planning. This is about control and violation on a level that's genuinely criminal." He set the photos aside and ran his hands through his hair, the gesture I'd learned to recognize as his way of processing information he didn't want to accept. "Even if this is what it looks like," he said, "what are we supposed to do about it? She's my mother, Brianna. She's family." The question hung between us, representing a choice that would define our marriage and our future. Tyler was asking me to choose between seeking justice for violations that affected my health and safety, and preserving family harmony by allowing Patricia to continue her interference unchallenged. The position was impossible, and I realized that this was probably exactly what Patricia had counted on when she'd decided to target me. "She stopped being family the moment she decided to assault me," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "This isn't about forgiveness or understanding or keeping the peace. This is about protecting myself from someone who's shown she's willing to violate my body and my choices to get what she wants." That night, I lay awake planning my next moves, while Tyler slept fitfully beside me. I couldn't let Patricia's violations continue, but I also couldn't trust that confronting her directly would result in anything other than denial and escalation. I needed more than evidence. I needed a strategy for exposing her actions in a way that would make continued manipulation impossible. The solution came to me as I was finally drifting off to sleep. Patricia had been documenting her crimes meticulously, but she'd been doing it in private, secure in the belief that her violations would never be discovered. If I could find a way to make her interference public, to expose her actions to the community where she'd built her reputation as a caring mother and pillar of respectability, she would face consequences that went far beyond family drama. I began planning what would become the most difficult confrontation of my life, knowing that once I chose this path, there would be no going back. Patricia had spent months violating my trust and my body. confident that her position as Tyler's mother would protect her from consequences. It was time to show her that some violations were too serious to hide behind the facade of family loyalty. The confrontation I'd been dreading came sooner than expected, triggered by Patricia's own overconfidence in her ability to manipulate the situation. 3 days after I'd discovered her evidence cache, she appeared at our door unannounced on Thursday evening, carrying a casserole dish and wearing the concerned expression she reserved for moments when she planned to extract information. "I've been worried about you, sweetie," she said as she swept past me into our kitchen, setting down the dish with the authority of someone who considered our home an extension of her own. "You seemed so distracted when you stopped by earlier this week. I hope everything is all right with your health." The casual reference to my unauthorized visit sent a chill down my spine. Patricia was letting me know she was aware of my presence in her house, but in a way that maintained her facade of innocent concern. She was testing me, trying to gauge how much I knew and how much I was willing to challenge her directly. Tyler was working late, which meant I was alone with Patricia for the first time since discovering the extent of her violations. She moved around our kitchen with familiar ease, opening cabinets and drawers as if she owned them, her actions a constant reminder of how thoroughly she'd infiltrated our private space. The new locks I'd installed seemed meaningless when she could still gain entry through emotional manipulation and Tyler's inability to establish boundaries. "Actually, I'm glad we have a chance to talk privately," I said, deciding that delaying this conversation would only give her more opportunities to cover her tracks or escalate her interference. "There are some things we need to discuss about my medical situation." Patricia's hands paused in their busy work of serving the casserole she'd brought, and I caught a flash of something calculating in her eyes before she resumed her helpful hostess performance. "Of course, dear. You know I'm always here to listen. Have you learned anything more from Dr. Martinez about those digestive issues you mentioned?" The way she phrased the question revealed how much she already knew about my recent medical appointments. Patricia had been monitoring my healthcare as closely as she'd been sabotaging it, staying informed about my doctor visits and test results through Tyler's dutiful updates. She was positioning herself as a concerned family member, while simultaneously working to undermine my health and autonomy. "Dr. Martinez discovered some interesting things about my birth control," I said, watching Patricia's reaction carefully. "It seems the medication I've been taking isn't working as effectively as it should be. Someone has been tampering with it." For just a moment, Patricia's mask slipped. I saw satisfaction flicker across her face before she rearranged her features into an expression of shock and concern. "Tampering? That's terrible, Brianna. Who would do such a thing? Have you contacted the pharmacy to report a manufacturing defect?" Her performance was flawless, hitting exactly the right notes of surprise and indignation that an innocent person would display. But I'd seen that momentary satisfaction, the brief glimpse of someone whose plan was working exactly as intended. Patricia wasn't just prepared for this accusation. She was enjoying it. "It wasn't a manufacturing defect," I replied, pulling out my phone to show her the photographs I'd taken in her house. "Someone with access to my medication has been systematically reducing its effectiveness using heat treatment and pill substitution. Someone who knows my schedule, has keys to my house, and has been tracking my menstrual cycle for months." Patricia looked at the images with the same careful attention she applied to everything else, her expression remaining perfectly controlled as she viewed evidence of her own crimes. She studied the calendar documenting her pill tampering activities, the medical supplies she'd hidden in her bathroom, the research she'd compiled about hormonal contraceptives. Her reaction was almost admirable in its complete lack of guilt or shame. "This is very disturbing," she said finally, handing my phone back with steady hands. "It looks like someone has been conducting some kind of experiment or research project. Have you considered that this might be related to your work? Sometimes people in marketing can attract attention from unstable individuals who become obsessed with employees." The deflection was masterful, redirecting suspicion away from herself while simultaneously suggesting I might be the target of a stranger's obsession. Patricia was demonstrating the same strategic thinking she'd used to plan her assault on my reproductive choices, staying several steps ahead of accusations while maintaining plausible deniability. "Patricia," I said, abandoning any pretense of diplomatic conversation, "these photographs were taken in your house. In your guest bathroom, behind cleaning supplies where you thought no one would look. That's your handwriting on the calendar documenting each time you tampered with my pills. This is your research about hormonal contraceptives and methods for sabotaging them. The silence that followed was profound, stretching between us like a chasm that revealed the true nature of our relationship. Patricia wasn't just Tyler's controlling mother, or an overeager potential grandmother. She was someone who had been systematically violating my body and my choices for months. Someone who saw me not as a person but as an obstacle to be overcome through deception and manipulation. "I think you're having some kind of breakdown," Patricia said finally, her voice taking on a tone of clinical concern that chilled me to the bone. "The stress of trying to conceive, combined with work pressure and whatever digestive issues you've been experiencing, has obviously affected your judgment. You're seeing conspiracies where none exist, making wild accusations against people who care about you." She was gaslighting me with the skill of someone who had been manipulating people for decades, using my own vulnerabilities against me, while positioning herself as the rational adult dealing with an unstable young woman. This was probably how she'd handled challenges to her authority throughout Tyler's childhood, dismissing valid concerns as emotional instability while maintaining her position as the reasonable parent. "I have medical evidence that my birth control has been tampered with," I said, working to keep my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "I have photographs of your supplies and documentation. I have proof that you've been systematically sabotaging my contraception while pretending to care about my health." Patricia moved closer, her expression shifting to something that looked like maternal concern but felt predatory. "Brianna, sweetheart, you need help. This kind of paranoid thinking isn't normal. I'm worried that you might hurt yourself or Tyler with these delusions. Maybe we should call Dr. Martinez together and explain what's been happening with your mental state." The suggestion was brilliant in its manipulativeness. If I agreed to call Dr. Martinez, Patricia could position the conversation as a mental health crisis rather than addressing the evidence of her crimes. If I refused, she could use my resistance as further proof of instability. She was setting up a scenario where any response I made would support her narrative that I was having a psychological breakdown. "Call Dr. Martinez," I said, surprising Patricia with my agreement. "I'd love for her to explain to you personally what heat-treated birth control pills look like under laboratory analysis. I'm sure she'll be fascinated to hear your theories about manufacturing defects and workplace stalkers." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Patricia's features. She'd been counting on my reluctance to involve medical professionals in what she was framing as a family dispute. The idea that Dr. Martinez might corroborate my accusations rather than questioning my mental state clearly hadn't occurred to her. Before Patricia could respond, we heard Tyler's key in the front door lock. His timing couldn't have been more perfect or more terrible, arriving just as the conversation reached a point where polite pretense was no longer possible. Patricia immediately began repositioning herself for his entrance, rearranging her expression into wounded confusion and moving to create a physical tableau that would support her version of events. "Tyler, thank goodness you're home," she said as soon as he entered the kitchen, her voice carrying just the right mixture of relief and concern. "I'm worried about Brianna. She's been making some very disturbing accusations, and I think she might need professional help." Tyler looked between us, taking in the tension that filled the room like smoke. He could see that something significant had happened during his absence, but Patricia was already shaping his understanding of the situation before I had a chance to explain. This was how she'd maintained control over his perceptions for years, getting to him first with her version of events and positioning any contradicting information as evidence of someone else's instability. "What kind of accusations?" Tyler asked, his voice carefully neutral in the way it became when he sensed conflict between the two women in his life. I handed him my phone, showing him the photographs I'd tried to share with Patricia. "I confronted your mother about the evidence we found in her house. The medical supplies, the calendar documenting her tampering with my birth control, the research she's been conducting about hormonal contraceptives. She's trying to convince me that I'm having a mental breakdown rather than acknowledging what she's been doing." Tyler studied the images again, his expression growing more troubled, as he processed the implications of Patricia's presence in our kitchen while this evidence existed. His mother wasn't denying access to her house or demanding to know how I'd obtained these photographs. She was trying to discredit my interpretation of evidence she couldn't dispute. "These pictures don't prove what you think they prove," Patricia said, her voice taking on the patient tone she used when explaining things to people she considered intellectually inferior. "Medical supplies have many legitimate uses. Research about contraceptives could be for educational purposes. You're connecting dots that don't actually connect because you want to blame someone for your fertility struggles." The accusation hit exactly where Patricia intended it to, targeting my deepest insecurities about our attempts to conceive. She was suggesting that my inability to get pregnant naturally was driving me to create elaborate conspiracy theories, rather than accepting responsibility for my own reproductive challenges. It was a cruel manipulation that revealed how thoroughly she understood my vulnerabilities. "Tyler," I said, ignoring Patricia's attempts to redirect the conversation, "your mother has been systematically tampering with my birth control for months. Dr. Martinez confirmed that someone has been heat-treating my pills to reduce their effectiveness. The evidence in these photographs shows that your mother has been documenting her interference while tracking my menstrual cycle like a scientific experiment." Tyler set down my phone and looked directly at his mother, and for the first time since this confrontation began, Patricia seemed genuinely uncertain about her ability to control the situation. She'd been counting on Tyler's loyalty and his reluctance to believe ill of the parent who'd raised him alone. But the weight of evidence was becoming impossible to dismiss, even for someone conditioned to accept his mother's version of reality. "Mom," Tyler said quietly, "is this true? Have you been interfering with Brianna's medication?" The directness of his question seemed to catch Patricia off guard. She'd been prepared to manipulate me, to gaslight and redirect and reframe, until I doubted my own perceptions. But Tyler's simple request for truth cut through her elaborate defense strategies, leaving her with nowhere to hide behind concerned maternal performance. "I don't think this is the right time to discuss these accusations," Patricia said, suddenly eager to leave a conversation she'd initiated with such confidence. "Brianna is clearly upset, and you're both under a lot of stress. Maybe we should all take some time to cool down before saying things we might regret," the retreat was telling. Patricia had come to our house prepared to confront me about my unauthorized presence in her home, confident in her ability to control the narrative and discredit any accusations I might make. But faced with Tyler's direct questioning and irrefutable physical evidence, she was abandoning her attack in favor of strategic withdrawal. "Answer the question, Mom," Tyler said, his voice carrying an authority I'd rarely heard him use with his mother. "Have you been tampering with Brianna's birth control? Have you been interfering with our reproductive choices without our knowledge or consent?" Patricia's mask finally dropped completely, revealing the calculating woman who'd been hiding behind maternal concern for months. "Everything I've done has been for your own good," she said, abandoning pretense in favor of justification. "You two have been married for 8 months without making any real progress towards starting a family. Sometimes people need guidance to overcome their own obstacles and fears." The admission was stunning in its casual arrogance. Patricia wasn't denying her interference. She was defending it as a necessary intervention in our lives. She'd appointed herself the arbiter of our reproductive timeline, deciding that our choices were wrong and taking action to correct them according to her own priorities. "You've been assaulting my wife," Tyler said, his voice shaking with an anger I'd never heard from him before. "You've been systematically violating her body and her choices while pretending to care about our family. This isn't guidance, Mom. This is criminal." Patricia's expression hardened at Tyler's characterization of her actions as assault. She'd been expecting gratitude for her interference, anticipating that once I became pregnant, we'd thank her for helping overcome our apparent reluctance to start a family. The idea that her violations might be viewed as crimes rather than helpful interventions clearly hadn't occurred to her. "Don't be so dramatic," she said, her tone shifting to the dismissive authority she'd used to control Tyler's perceptions throughout his childhood. "I helped speed up a process you both wanted anyway. No harm was done, and now you have the information you need to move forward more effectively." The casual dismissal of my bodily autonomy was breathtaking. Patricia had spent months systematically undermining my reproductive choices, putting my health at risk and violating my trust in the most intimate ways possible. But in her mind, these actions were justified by her assessment of our family planning timeline, and her belief that her desires took precedence over our actual choices. "Get out," Tyler said, his voice carrying a finality that seemed to surprise even him. "Get out of our house and stay away from us. If you ever interfere in our lives again, if you ever come near Brianna or access our home without permission, I'll call the police." Patricia stared at her son with an expression of genuine shock. Tyler had never challenged her authority so directly, never chosen his wife's well-being over his mother's wishes. For perhaps the first time in her life, Patricia was facing consequences for behavior she'd always been able to justify or excuse. "Tyler, you can't be serious," she said, her voice taking on a pleading quality I'd never heard before. "I'm your mother. Everything I do is because I love you and want what's best for your family. You can't throw away our relationship over a misunderstanding about birth control pills." But Tyler was already moving toward the door, holding it open with the kind of determined authority that made it clear this wasn't a temporary cooling-off period. "What you did wasn't love, Mom. Love doesn't involve violating someone's body and choices. Love doesn't involve months of deception and manipulation. What you did was assault, and I won't allow you to minimize it or continue having access to hurt Brianna again." Patricia gathered her purse and the empty casserole dish she'd brought, her movements sharp with anger and disbelief. As she reached the door, she turned back one final time, her expression mixing fury with something that looked almost like genuine confusion about why her interference wasn't being received with gratitude. "This isn't over," she said, her voice carrying the cold certainty of someone who'd never learned to accept defeat gracefully. "Family doesn't abandon family over misunderstandings. You'll realize that eventually, and when you do, I'll be waiting." The threat was clear, even wrapped in language about family loyalty and forgiveness. Patricia wasn't accepting the consequences of her actions or acknowledging the severity of her violations. She was planning her next move, already strategizing ways to regain access and control over our lives. As the door closed behind her, Tyler and I stood in our kitchen, surrounded by the wreckage of everything we'd thought we knew about our family dynamics. Patricia's assault on my reproductive choices had been devastating enough, but the realization that she saw nothing wrong with her actions suggested that this confrontation was just the beginning of a much larger battle for our autonomy and safety. The restraining order was granted 3 days later, after I spent a morning in the Millbrook courthouse explaining to a family court judge why I needed legal protection from my mother-in-law. The process was more straightforward than I'd expected, largely because Dr. Martinez had provided a detailed affidavit documenting the medical evidence of tampering and the health risks Patricia's actions had created. Tyler sat beside me in the courtroom, his presence a quiet affirmation that we were facing this together, despite the damage it was causing to his relationship with his mother. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Richardson, listened to our testimony with the kind of professional detachment that somehow made the whole experience feel more legitimate and less like a family drama. "Mrs. Bell will be prohibited from contacting you directly or indirectly, entering your residence or workplace, or interfering with your medical care in any way," Judge Richardson explained as she signed the order. "Violation of these terms will result in immediate arrest and criminal charges. Do you understand the seriousness of these restrictions?" The judge's question was directed at Patricia's attorney, a nervous young man who'd spent the hearing trying to characterize his client's actions as well-intentioned family involvement rather than criminal interference. Patricia herself wasn't present, having chosen to let her lawyer handle what she apparently still considered a minor misunderstanding that would blow over once emotions cooled. Walking out of that courthouse felt like emerging from underwater, finally able to breathe freely after months of suffocation I hadn't fully recognized until it was gone. Tyler squeezed my hand as we reached the parking lot, his touch conveying both relief and grief for the relationship with his mother that we'd been forced to sacrifice for my safety and well-being. But Patricia's response to the restraining order proved that Tyler had been right to prioritize my protection over family harmony. Rather than respecting the court's directive or attempting to make amends for her violations, she launched a campaign designed to isolate us from our social circle and damage my reputation within the community where we'd built our life together. The first sign of her strategy came through Chloe, who called me at work the following Tuesday with the tone of voice I'd never heard from her before. She sounded confused, almost hesitant, as she asked whether everything was okay in my marriage and whether I'd been having problems with Tyler's family that she should know about. "Patricia called me yesterday," Chloe explained. "She said she was worried about you, that you'd been acting paranoid and making accusations against people who care about you. She mentioned that you'd gotten some kind of legal order against her, and that Tyler was too loyal to see how your mental state was affecting the family. The manipulation was brilliant in its simplicity. Patricia was using my own support network against me, reaching out to friends and acquaintances with expressions of concern that positioned her as a worried mother-in-law dealing with an unstable daughter-in-law. She was reframing the restraining order not as protection from her criminal interference, but as evidence of my psychological instability and Tyler's misguided loyalty. She asked if I'd noticed any changes in your behavior lately, Chloe continued. Whether you'd been obsessing over conspiracy theories or showing signs of paranoia. She made it sound like she was trying to help you get the mental health support you needed. But something about the conversation felt wrong. I explained the truth about Patricia's tampering with my birth control, the evidence we'd discovered, and the medical documentation that had supported our request for a restraining order. Chloe listened with growing anger, recognizing the sophistication of Patricia's manipulation and the way she'd tried to use genuine friendship to undermine my credibility. That woman is absolutely diabolical, Chloe said when I finished recounting the full scope of Patricia's violations. She's not just trying to control your reproductive choices. She's trying to destroy your reputation and isolate you from anyone who might support you against her. Over the following weeks, it became clear that Chloe wasn't the only person Patricia had contacted with her version of events. Tyler started receiving calls from extended family members expressing concern about our marriage, and suggesting that perhaps I needed professional help to deal with whatever stress was causing me to turn against his mother. His cousins, aunts, and longtime family friends had all been reached with carefully crafted messages that painted Patricia as a victim of my instability. The social pressure was immense, designed to make Tyler question his decision to support me over his mother, and to convince our community that I was an unreliable narrator of my own experiences. Patricia understood that truth was only as powerful as people's willingness to believe it, and she was systematically undermining my credibility before I could share my story publicly. But Patricia made a critical error in her campaign against us. In her eagerness to discredit me and pressure Tyler into reconciliation, she violated the restraining order by attempting to contact me directly through social media. The message was brief and seemingly innocuous, just a Facebook friend request accompanied by a note saying she missed me and hoped we could work through our misunderstanding like family should. The violation gave us grounds to have Patricia arrested, but more importantly, it demonstrated to Tyler's extended family that his mother wasn't the reasonable victim she'd portrayed herself to be in her calls to them. Someone genuinely concerned about a family member's mental health wouldn't violate a legal order designed to protect that person's well-being. Tyler's Aunt Diane was the first to call and apologize after Patricia's arrest made local news. "I should have known better than to take Patricia's word without hearing your side," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "She's always been manipulative, but I never imagined she'd go this far. Tyler is lucky to have someone who won't be bullied into silence." The support that followed Patricia's legal troubles was gratifying, but it couldn't undo the months of violation I'd experienced or the damage her actions had caused to my sense of security and bodily autonomy. Even with Patricia legally prohibited from contacting us, I found myself constantly vigilant for signs of her interference, checking my medication obsessively and feeling anxious whenever Tyler was late coming home from work. Dr. Martinez recommended a therapist who specialized in helping victims of intimate partner violence, explaining that Patricia's systematic violation of my reproductive choices fell into the same category as other forms of domestic abuse. Even though it had been perpetrated by a family member rather than a romantic partner, the therapeutic process was challenging, requiring me to confront not just Patricia's violations, but my own tendency to minimize harm when it came wrapped in language about family and love. "What Patricia did to you was profoundly violating," Dr. Sarah Chen, my therapist, explained during one of our early sessions. "She systematically undermined your bodily autonomy while maintaining a facade of care and concern. That kind of calculated deception can be even more traumatic than overt violence, because it makes you question your own perceptions and judgment." Through therapy, I began to understand that my initial reluctance to confront Patricia hadn't been weakness or excessive politeness. It had been a rational response to someone who was skilled at using social expectations and family dynamics to shield her abusive behavior from scrutiny. Patricia had counted on my reluctance to make waves, my desire to maintain family harmony, and my fear of being labeled as difficult or paranoid. The healing process was slow and sometimes frustrating, complicated by the fact that Patricia's violations had been so intimate and systematic. Unlike a single traumatic event, her interference had been woven into months of daily life, making it difficult to separate legitimate memories from moments that had been tainted by her manipulation. But gradually, I began to reclaim my sense of agency and trust in my own judgment. Tyler struggled with his own healing process, grappling with the realization that his mother had been capable of such calculated harm while maintaining her performance as a loving parent. He started his own therapy sessions, working through feelings of guilt for not recognizing Patricia's manipulative patterns sooner, and grief for the relationship with his mother that could never be repaired. I keep thinking about all the times she interfered in our decisions, and I defended her as just being helpful. Tyler told me one evening as we sat in our renovated kitchen, the space finally feeling like it belonged to us rather than serving as an extension of Patricia's domain. How many other boundaries did she cross that I dismissed as normal motherly concern? The question was difficult to answer because Patricia's violations had been so thoroughly integrated into what Tyler had been taught to accept as normal family dynamics. She'd been conditioning him since childhood to prioritize her emotions and desires over his own judgment, creating a dynamic where questioning her behavior felt like betrayal rather than healthy boundary setting. But as Tyler worked through his own therapeutic process, he began setting firmer boundaries with other family members who'd been influenced by Patricia's manipulation. He made it clear to aunts, cousins, and family friends that our decision to pursue legal protection hadn't been made lightly, and that anyone hoping for eventual reconciliation was misunderstanding the severity of what Patricia had done. 6 months after obtaining the restraining order, I discovered I was pregnant. The pregnancy was planned this time, the result of informed choices made with full control over my reproductive health, rather than Patricia's covert manipulation. Dr. Martinez monitored the pregnancy carefully, both because of my previous health issues and because of the emotional complexity of conceiving a child in the aftermath of such systematic reproductive violations. Tyler and I made the decision early to keep the pregnancy private until we were ready to share the news publicly, unwilling to risk Patricia learning about it and attempting to insert herself into our growing family despite the legal restrictions. When we finally announced our pregnancy at 16 weeks, we did so selectively, sharing the news only with people we trusted to respect our boundaries and support our decisions about family involvement. The baby shower planning became an opportunity to reclaim positive associations with celebrations that had been tainted by Patricia's manipulation. This time, I was involved in every decision, from the guest list to the decorations to the venue. Chloe organized the event with careful attention to my comfort level, creating an atmosphere that felt genuinely celebratory rather than performative or controlling. At 38 weeks pregnant, I felt empowered in ways I'd never experienced before Patricia's violations forced me to recognize and defend my own agency. The pregnancy was progressing normally, my relationship with Tyler had grown stronger through our shared trauma recovery, and our home felt secure in ways that went beyond new locks and restraining orders. But the most significant change was internal, a fundamental shift in how I understood my own worth and my right to make choices about my body and my life. Patricia's attempts to control my reproductive decisions had been traumatic, but surviving them had taught me that I was capable of protecting myself even against people who claimed to love me while systematically violating my autonomy. The legal case against Patricia eventually resulted in criminal charges for tampering with medication and harassment, though her plea bargain kept her out of prison in favor of probation and mandatory counseling. The conviction created a permanent record of her actions, making it impossible for her to continue portraying herself as a misunderstood victim of family drama rather than someone who'd committed serious crimes. Tyler and I moved to a different neighborhood before our daughter was born, putting physical distance between ourselves and the places where Patricia's interference had dominated our daily lives. The new house felt clean in ways that had nothing to do with previous owners or fresh paint, unmarked by memories of violation and manipulation. Our daughter Emma arrived on a crisp October morning, her birth attended by medical professionals I'd chosen myself, and celebrated by friends who respected our decisions about family involvement. Tyler cried when he held her for the first time, and I knew he was grieving not just for his complicated relationship with his own mother, but for the grandmother Emma would never safely know. In the quiet moments during those first weeks of motherhood, I sometimes thought about Patricia's stated desire for grandchildren and her willingness to violate my body and choices to achieve that goal. She'd claimed to want what was best for our family, but her actions had demonstrated that she was primarily interested in satisfying her own desires, regardless of the cost to our well-being or autonomy. Emma would grow up knowing that family love should never require sacrificing your safety or accepting violations of your boundaries. She'd learn that people who truly care about you respect your choices even when they disagree with them, and that claiming to act out of love doesn't justify causing harm to achieve your own goals. The restraining order remained in effect, renewed automatically each year as long as we requested it. Patricia never attempted direct contact again after her arrest, but we occasionally heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved to another state and was telling people there a version of events that portrayed her as the victim of an ungrateful daughter-in-law who'd turned her son against her. Tyler's response to these reports was a shrug and a comment about how some people never learn to accept consequences for their actions. His growth in understanding manipulative dynamics and healthy boundaries had been remarkable, transforming him from someone who reflexively defended his mother's behavior to someone who could recognize and reject manipulation even when it came from people he loved. 2 years after Emma's birth, I started volunteering with a support group for women who'd experienced reproductive coercion, sharing my story with others who'd survived partners, family members, or acquaintances who'd interfered with their contraception or fertility decisions. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply meaningful, helping other survivors recognize that their experiences were valid and their boundaries deserved respect. Many of the women I worked with had experienced violations from romantic partners who'd sabotaged birth control to force pregnancy or prevent it. But some had stories similar to mine involving family members who decided they knew better than the women themselves about reproductive timing. The common thread was always the same. Someone had decided that their desires were more important than the victim's bodily autonomy and right to make informed choices. What you survived wasn't about birth control, I often told the women in our support group. It was about someone deciding that your body and your choices belong to them rather than to you. That's a violation that goes far beyond medication tampering. And healing from it requires recognizing that you always deserved better treatment than what you received. The message resonated because it addressed the core issue that many survivors struggled with. Understanding that violations wrapped in language about love and family were still violations, and that people who truly cared about their well-being wouldn't systematically undermine their health and autonomy to achieve their own goals. Tyler sometimes joined me at support group events, sharing his perspective as someone who'd had to confront a family member's abusive behavior and choose his spouse's safety over family loyalty. His insights were valuable for partners and family members who were struggling to understand how to support survivors while navigating their own complicated relationships with perpetrators. The hardest part was accepting that my mother's actions weren't really about grandchildren or family, Tyler explained during one particularly moving session. They were about control and her belief that she had the right to make decisions about other people's bodies and lives. Once I understood that, supporting Brianna wasn't a choice between my wife and my mother. It was a choice between right and wrong. On Emma's 3rd birthday, we celebrated with a small party in our backyard, surrounded by friends who'd supported us through our journey towards safety and healing. The guest list included Dr. Martinez, who'd become not just Emma's pediatrician but a trusted friend who understood the significance of our daughter's existence as a symbol of reproductive choice and bodily autonomy. As I watched Emma blow out her candles, laughing with delight at the simple joy of being celebrated by people who loved her without conditions or hidden agendas, I felt profound gratitude for the difficult path that had led us to this moment. Patricia's violations had been traumatic and life-changing, but surviving them had taught me invaluable lessons about recognizing manipulation, setting boundaries, and protecting the people I loved from harm. The story that had begun with systematic violation and deception had evolved into something more complex and ultimately hopeful, a testament to the possibility of healing from intimate betrayal, the importance of believing survivors even when their experiences seem impossible to accept, and the fundamental right of every person to make informed choices about their own body and life. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never discovered Patricia's interference, if her plan had worked, and I'd become pregnant without understanding why my contraception had failed. The thought is chilling because it represents not just a violation of my reproductive choices, but a fundamental theft of my agency and right to make informed decisions about my own life. But that alternative timeline feels distant now, overshadowed by the reality of the life Tyler and I have built together based on truth, mutual respect, and healthy boundaries. Emma is growing up in a household where consent and bodily autonomy are foundational values, where love is demonstrated through respect rather than control, and where family means supporting each other's choices rather than manipulating them for personal gain. The scars from Patricia's violations will always be part of my story, but they're no longer the defining elements of my identity. Instead, they've become evidence of my resilience and my capacity to protect myself and my family from harm, even when that harm comes from people who claim to love us while systematically violating our trust and safety. In the end, Patricia's attempt to control my reproductive choices had the opposite effect of what she'd intended. Instead of making me more compliant or grateful for her interference, her violations had taught me to recognize manipulation, trust my own judgment, and fight for my right to make decisions about my own body and life. The lessons were painful, but they were also empowering in ways that have shaped every aspect of who I've become as a wife, mother, and advocate for other survivors. Emma will never know her paternal grandmother, and sometimes that reality feels like a loss. But she's growing up surrounded by people who understand that true family love never requires sacrificing your safety or accepting violations of your boundaries. That lesson, hard-won through trauma and healing, is perhaps the most valuable inheritance I can give her. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.